In late 1952, a Romanian court sentenced a group of engineers to death for sabotaging a canal. The canal was a failure, yes, but they had not sabotaged it. They were chosen to take the blame for a catastrophe the state itself had built. 3 of them would be shot. And barely a year later, the regime would quietly abandon the very project they supposedly betrayed. This is the story of a trial designed to bury the truth alongside the bodies. Welcome to the Black File. Tonight, we do not open the dossier on the camps themselves. We open the one on the cover-up. By 1952, the Danube Black Sea Canal was a disaster. It had swallowed 3 years of labor and vast sums of money. It had consumed the lives of starving prisoners who dug it by hand, with shovels and pickaxes under impossible quotas. And after all of it, almost no usable canal existed. A great socialist project, announced with fanfare, had produced a ditch and a graveyard. Someone would have to answer for that. The regime had already decided it would not be the regime. First, a distinction that matters more than any other. The canal that ships glide through today was not built by these prisoners. That waterway came later. Its main branch was constructed between 1976 and 1984 under Ceausescu, with paid workers, with heavy machines, and with no forced labor at all. The project on trial here is the first one. The failed one. The lethal attempt that ran from 1949 to 1953, where tens of thousands of political prisoners were sent to dig with shovels and pickaxes, and where the real output was never a waterway. It was fear. 2 projects, the same route, but only one of them was a crime scene. By 1952, that first attempt was collapsing under its own impossibility, and the regime was looking for a way out. A regime built on the myth of socialist progress cannot admit that its grand project has failed. To admit failure would be to admit the plan itself was wrong. And the plan came from the top, from the party, ultimately from Moscow, so the failure could not belong to the system. It had to belong to someone else. It had to be sabotage, hidden enemies working from inside, deliberately wrecking the people's canal. The story almost wrote itself, because the regime needed it written. All that remained was to choose the men who would be made to play the saboteurs, and then to make them confess. The accused were engineers and technical men who'd actually worked on the canal. Among them was the engine driver Nichita Dumitrescu, a man who ran the locomotives that hauled the spoil. Beside him stood the engineers Aurel Rozei-Rozenberg and Nicolae Vasilescu-Colorado. And a second group formed around the engineer George Crucian. These were not spies, and they were not wreckers. They were specialists who'd been close enough to the project's failure to make believable scapegoats. They knew where the money had gone and why the work had stalled, which made them dangerous and useful at the same time. Proximity to the disaster was their only real crime. The charges were chosen for maximum menace, espionage, fraud, and sabotage. Espionage tied the accused to foreign powers. Fraud made them thieves of the people's money. Sabotage made them the deliberate authors of the project's ruin. Together, the 3 charges turned ordinary engineers into agents of a vast hidden conspiracy. But charges in a Stalinist trial are not arguments to be proven. They are conclusions to be confessed. And to obtain the confessions, the regime turned to the methods it knew best. The confessions were extracted under torture by a squad of the Securitate secret police operating under Alexandru Nicolae, one of the most feared men in the apparatus. The wider inquiry was orchestrated by Iosif Chichinevsky, a senior figure in the party leadership. This was not a police investigation that happened to be brutal. The brutality was the method. Break the man, write his confession, and present the broken man to the court as proof. The verdict came as scripted. 3 men were condemned to death and executed: Nichita Dumitrescu, Aurel Rozei-Rozenberg, and Nicolae Vasilescu-Colorado. The second group, around Gorge Crucian, received crushing sentences, including 3 life terms. Engineers were put to death for sabotaging a project that the system itself had doomed, with starvation, with quotas no human could meet, with shovels where machines were needed. The men who built the disaster sat in judgment of the men they blamed for it. Then came the part the regime never wrote into the script. On the 5th of March 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The man whose instruction had set the whole project in motion was gone. The pressure that had driven the frenzy began to lift, and the project's deep economic exhaustion could no longer be hidden. On the 18th of July 1953, the canal works were quietly suspended. The great socialist construction simply stopped. It came to a discreet halt, with no fanfare and no announcement of failure. So consider what that means. The saboteurs had been executed for sabotaging a project that the regime then abandoned of its own free will, only months later, without a fight. The crime they died for was never real. And the thing they supposedly destroyed, the state quietly destroyed itself. And the final irony arrived years later. Under Ceausescu, the very same Romanian state rehabilitated the very people it had condemned in 1952. The convictions were reversed. The dead engineers were declared innocent. Think about what that act really was. A regime almost never overturns its own show trials, because to do so is to admit that the show was staged. That quiet reversal was a confession in itself, an admission written into the regime's own files that the trial had been a lie from the very start. As for the dead of the camps that the trial was built to hide, the regime's official ledger recorded 656 deaths. Historians and survivor associations put the true number far higher, into the thousands. The full toll has never been agreed, and it remains disputed to this day. So the 1952 trial stands as a near-perfect specimen of Stalinist justice. Manufacture the guilt, kill the scapegoats, bury the truth in the same ground as the bodies. The canal that finally carries ships today erased its own origin story, and almost nothing marks the men who were shot to protect a lie. We remember them here because the file should never have been closed. Thank you for sitting with this one. If these buried stories matter to you, consider subscribing so the next dossier finds you. Take care of yourselves.